Last week's episode was, we titled it, What Was Life Really Like for the United Empire Loyalists? And I got a lot of comments from people saying, well, it wasn't so pretty on our side as well. So think of this as a sequel. So today I'm going to talk about what was life really like for the Patriots. And I try to get my head around, and perhaps you can as well, but we're talking about a country that's soon to be, that's never had a need for an army. Their army is across the ocean. They're supported by the Army and the Navy of Great Britain, or the British Empire. And now all of a sudden they're forced to create an army. So during the 8-year conflict, there were 231,000 Continental soldiers and 145,000 militia, roughly, or close to 145,000. And the part I try to get my head around is they're just creating this army. They don't know what a quartermaster is. And now they have to supply them with every need you can imagine that a marching army needs. Literally thousands of tons of provisions a day. And I'm going to get into some of the deprivations that these poor people live through. And it certainly, as I point out, it's a two-sided coin. It was no better for the American revolutionaries than it was for the loyalists that had to flee the country or were forced out of the country or soon to be country. So anyway, I'm going to walk on. I'm heading back to Kelly Station where if it were in that conflict, I'd be forting up today. So the first year of the war goes pretty good for the Continentals at Trenton and Princeton, New Jersey. However, we all know the story of Valley Forge. So the winter of 77, 78, they're entrenched at Valley Forge and they simply don't have any supplies. And worse than that, I mean, they don't even have a single blanket per man. They've built huts, they're trying to survive through the winter, and they're essentially out of food. The rations that they were typically given during the first year of the campaign have been cut down to almost nothing. There are accounts where they would go 5 to 6 days without any bread, sometimes 5 to 6 days without any meat, and some days 5 to 6 days without either. But worse than Valley Forge is the following winter at Morristown, New Jersey. And that, without doubt, is Washington's trial by fire, if you would, in terms of trying to keep his soldiers an army. They're down to, at times, eating bark from trees in their leather boots. They're eating dogs. They're occasionally getting supplied. And a lot of that goes back to they had no concept of what this war was going to cost. And you've got all these independent colonies that are voting on, some of them don't like the amount it's costing, and the supplies are slow to get funded and certainly very slow to get to Washington's army. Now we can add to that, worse than the battle itself in terms of death, is what's happening in the camps. We've got every fathomable, communicable disease possible. You've got typhus, you've got smallpox, you've got pneumonia, you've got yellow fever. It's a nightmare, and Washington realizes that as this progresses, with the lack of food, with all these diseases, with the mortality rate in their own very camps, that he's starting to see the morale drop in his army, and people that are running off, going AWOL. It's growing, and Washington realizes that if he doesn't do something, he's essentially going to lose the Continental Army and the continent. There we go. We've made it to Kelly Station. Once I get inside, I'm going to sit down. Bit of a trek this morning, but I'm going to talk about the real deprivations that the Patriots went through once I get in the fort. And if you can imagine, it's far worse than Valley Forge or Morristown in terms of what they had to endure. And to try to set that stage again from the previous show, I should point out too that those United American Loyalists or United Empire Loyalists that arrived on British-owned soil, Canada's Caribbeans and other places, they weren't the ones that inflicting this horrific story I'm about to relate to you. It was the British soldiers proper, the people on the other side of that ocean, the people in the red coats. And yeah, it's a pretty horrific story. Before I get into the deprivations brought upon the Patriots by the British, I should point out what their rations were, or supposed to be. And it was established early by Congress of what each soldier should get. So on a daily basis, they get 1 pound of beef, or a 1/4 pound of pork, or 1 pound of salt fish, 3 pints of beans or peas weekly, 1 quart of either cider or spruce beer, and 1 pint of milk daily. So pretty bland diet, but as I mentioned, these supplies simply aren't coming in. They just don't have the resources to do it. And Washington at one point, in one of his lower moments, I think after Morristown, he's quoted as saying, one or the other of the following will happen: starvation, dispersal, or dissolving of our army. So I don't know how he was able to, given the conditions that these patriotic soldiers were living under and fighting under, how he was able to keep that army together boggles my mind, but he was able to. Obviously, we know the outcome of history. And I think at this point I want to get into prisoners of war. And this is a really sad part of the history of that conflict. So King George III, when independence is declared, he calls all American colonists that take up arms against Britain to be traitors. And essentially what that does is it negates any proper conditions one might give to their prisoners of war. 3 months after the war starts in the colonies, the British start bringing prison ships off the coast. So we got them in Savannah, we got them in Charleston, they're in the bay off Brooklyn, they're in New York. New York and Brooklyn become the hub. They had them in Canada's, and as I say, off the coast of Florida. They were everywhere, but the most notorious of them all was HMS Jersey. And we know, well, perhaps we don't know. If one looks statistically, at the end of the 8-year conflict, over 11,000 men and boys died on those prison ships, more than actually died on land during the battles. And I'm going to get into the HMS, but the story that a lot of us don't hear is how brave these patriots were, and how committed they were to the cause of freedom from monarchy, the right to have representation, the right to have a vote, and what lengths they would go to in order to maintain that and fight for that cause. If one found themselves captured, and God forbid you were located on one of those floating, what did one call a receptacle of human misery, the British now are starting to see signs that they're losing this war, and that's a pretty hard pill for them to swallow. So they're doing anything to recruit. They're offering cash. They're telling the prisoners that their families are going to starve on the street, and they offer them the right to enlist, sign allegiance to the king, enlist, and essentially they're going to be fighting their own kin, their own brothers and sisters and friends and neighbors. So the figures vary, but what I've read from documentation that I can find is that approximately 7 to 8% actually did. The others chose to just stay on, and essentially they faced death by refusing to do this. And that's the part that I find absolutely remarkable. Trying to think of a few of the quotes that I read from, particularly from the Jersey. One of the diary accounts I heard from the Jersey was a fellow said, I now find myself in a loathsome prison with the most disgusting and wretched objects that I ever beheld in human form. The disease was rampant. All the diseases I mentioned in that camp, plus a few others. The food wasn't food that you would feed to people. It was food that, for example, meats that had gone rancid were full of maggots, and that's what was thrown down into the holds of these ships. There was no fresh air. It was just literally a living nightmare to be on one of those British prison ships. Another one that it struck a chord with me when I first read it was an individual who said that every spark of humanity has fled from the breast of the British officers who are in charge of these floating vessels of misery. A lot of people might wonder why, if there were literally thousands and thousands of men on the Jersey, why didn't they overpower the guards? And I think the reality is they simply didn't have the strength. There's, I can't think of his last name, Christopher or something. I believe he was age 17 at the time. One of the few to escape. And during a lightning thunderstorm at night, he was able to smash through one of the ports, the gun ports in the ship, the noise disguised from the thunder, and he literally had to swim miles to shore, arriving at shore naked with only his hat. Yeah, so it was grim indeed. And George Washington repeatedly wrote to his British counterparts demanding or insisting that they treat the prisoners better than what he'd heard rumors of. And had he known how bad it really was, well, his efforts were for naught, let's put it that way. I'll leave you with a final story that really shows the resilience of these patriots that were on board those horrible ships. So on the Jersey, on July 4th, 1782, they hold a July 4th celebration. And they'd made little flags from the rags of their clothes, and they were singing songs, and there was merriment, if that could be had, on those horrible things. But it so infuriated the guard that at bayonet point they opened the holes, they forced them all down into the bottom of the ship. But the singing continued, and it continued well into the night. So with a lantern in one hand and a cutlass in the other hand, they opened the hatches and slashed away at whoever they could reach. In the morning, they brought 10 dead Patriots up onto the deck of the ship for disposal. It's not quite a year later, so April 1783, that the last prisoners are released in New York off the Jersey, and the Jersey is left to rot into history. Anyway, it's a sad reflection of what war was really like, and I guess I'm trying to balance it, if you would, in terms of my story last week on Loyalists and what they endured, and my story this week on what the Patriots had to endure as well.